Be honest. At some point in your educational or maybe your professional life, you have taken one of those quizzes.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone has taken one.
Right. You answer a dozen questions about whether you prefer to look at a diagram or, listen to a recorded lecture or build a physical model. And at the end, you are handed this definitive label.
Yes, you get categorized as a visual learner or maybe an auditory learner.
Or a kinesthetic learner.
Exactly.
Exactly. And it feels incredibly validating, doesn't it? Like you've finally been handed the secret user manual to your own brain.
Well, I mean, we naturally crave that kind of categorization. Learning complex new information is an inherently chaotic and, quite frankly, vulnerable process.
Oh, for sure. It can be really intimidating.
It really is. So being handed a neat little label gives us this comforting illusion of control over that chaos. It tells you that if you just consume information in this one specific format, the friction of learning will just, well, it'll magically disappear.
But we all know, intuitively, that the learning styles theory has some holes in it. Because the real world just doesn't neatly categorize information for us.
No, it certainly doesn't.
But today, we are going far beyond just poking holes. We have a stack of incredibly rigorous academic research for this deep dive.
We really do. Some major foundational studies.
Yeah, we're looking at a pivotal study from Pashler and colleagues, cognitive psychologist Daniel Willingham's research on learning theories, and Philip Newton's paper on the thriving myth of learning styles. Okay, let's unpack this. Because looking at this data reveals exactly why our brains trick us into believing this neuromyth, and more importantly, how much cognitive potential we waste by indulging it.
I'm so glad we're tackling this because it fundamentally shifts how we understand human cognition. When you look at the underlying mechanics of memory, you realize we've spent decades building an entire educational and corporate training infrastructure around a neurological mechanism that simply does not exist.
Which is wild to wrap your head around.
It is. Peeling back this myth doesn't just debunk a popular idea, though. It gives you the actual scientifically proven tools to master any subject, whether you're prepping for a big meeting or trying to pick up a new hobby.
So to really dismantle this, we first have to define the specific mechanism the theory actually claims is happening in the brain. Because it's not just about what you like, right? It makes a hard biological claim.
Right. The scientific term for that claim is the meshing hypothesis.
The meshing hypothesis.
Yes, and this is the core argument dissected in the Pashler study. The meshing hypothesis dictates that instruction is only highly effective when the format perfectly matches a learner's predetermined style.
So if you identify as a visual learner, the theory insists your brain will synthesize and retain a concept significantly better if it's presented in a chart or a diagram.
Exactly. Better than, say, listening to an expert explain it verbally.
So it's like expecting a diet to only be effective if it consists entirely of your favorite foods.
That is a brilliant analogy. It assumes preference equals a biological requirement for absorption.
But from what I'm reading in the Pashler study, the moment researchers actually test this in a rigorously designed, controlled laboratory environment, the entire framework collapses. I mean, how does a concept so widely accepted just fail in the lab?
What's fascinating here is the sheer, repeatable consistency of that failure. To prove that learning styles biologically exist, scientists look for a very specific statistical result. They call it a crossover interaction.
Okay, crossover interaction, what does that actually look like in an experiment?
Well, imagine you take a group of self-identified visual learners and a group of auditory learners, and you teach them all the exact same material twice, once using only visuals and once using only audio.
Got it. Two distinct groups, two distinct formats.
Right. So for the theory to be true, the data must show a literal crossover. The visual learners must score higher on the visual test than the auditory learners do.
And then the auditory learners must outperform the visual learners on the audio test.
Exactly. The lines on the performance graph literally have to cross over each other to prove that the mashing process created an exclusive benefit.
And let me guess, they don't cross.
They never cross.
Mm-hmm.
In study after study across decades of research, that crossover interaction just fails to materialize.
Wow. So what does the data actually show then?
What it actually shows is that if a certain visual presentation is highly effective at explaining a concept, it is highly effective for everyone. And if a certain audio lecture is confusing and poorly structured, well, it's confusing for everyone.
So the data simply does not support the idea that tailoring the sensory format to an individual's self-reported style provides any measurable benefit at all.
None whatsoever. The format itself isn't the magic key.
That is incredibly counterintuitive. We spent decades handing out surveys to figure out how people learn best. Which brings up a massive question for me. If matching the sensory input to a specific style doesn't actually dictate how well we retain information, what is the brain actually doing when we learn something new?
To answer that, we have to look at the cognitive psychology of memory. You see, most of us walk around assuming our brains function like a digital hard drive.
Oh, totally. We think we have a photo gallery folder for our visual memories and like a separate folder of MP3 audio recordings for the things we hear.
Right, that's exactly how most people visualize it.
I know I do. But if I see a great infographic in a meeting, I just assume my brain takes a JPEG screenshot of it. And during the presentation, I just close my eyes and open that JPEG.
It's a very common assumption, but neurologically it is entirely false. In reality, long-term memories are stored based on their underlying meaning.
Wait, meaning, not pictures or sounds.
Exactly. This is a concept known as semantic memory. They are largely independent of the sensory modality. The sight, the sound, the touch that was originally used to intake the information.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Wait, so if I read a description of a concept or hear a podcast, actually, let's say hear an audio documentary explaining that same concept, my brain just stores the meaning of the concept regardless of how it got in?
Yes. Your brain is a meaning-making machine. It weaves new information into existing webs of knowledge, which we call schemas.
So we need a better way to visualize this process. Let's say building a long-term memory is like building a brick house. The sensory input, whether that's reading a dense textbook, listening to an audiobook, or watching a documentary that's just the delivery truck dropping off the bricks.
That is a fantastic way to look at it.
Right, because the brain doesn't actually care if the bricks arrived via a red truck or a blue truck. It only cares about taking those bricks and building a strong foundation.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanics of semantic memory. Think about when you learn the rules of a complex new board game.
Okay, yeah, like Settlers of Catan or something.
Right. Your brain isn't storing the specific font the rules were printed in, and it isn't storing the exact pitch of your friend's voice as they explain the rules to you.
It extracts the conceptual relationships. It stores the logic, the rules, the meaning.
Precisely. Therefore, presenting the exact same meaning through different sensory channels doesn't inherently change how well the brain retains the core information.
For you listening, think about how liberating this is. You don't need to panic if a manual doesn't have a perfectly designed infographic.
No, you really don't. Your brain is fully equipped to handle it.
And you don't need to spend hours trying to find a video explanation of a topic just because you think you're a visual learner. Your brain is already heavily optimized to extract the meaning from whatever delivery truck shows up.
It frees up an immense amount of cognitive energy. We shouldn't be asking, how do I like to receive information? We should be asking, how do I best extract the underlying meaning from this specific type of material?
I do have to push back a little here, though. If semantic memory is all about meaning and these distinct learning styles are a complete myth, why are we all so convinced that we have one?
It's a fair question. It feels very personal.
Yeah. I mean, I know for a fact I prefer looking at a map rather than having someone read me driving directions over the phone. Why does this myth feel so undeniably true?
Well, Willingham's research addresses this directly. The myth of learning styles is so stubbornly persistent because it's wrapped around a very real, scientifically backed grain of truth.
Okay, so what's the grain of truth?
Humans absolutely do have subjective preferences. It is an undeniable fact that you might prefer looking at a map over listening to verbal directions.
So the preference is real. My desire for the map isn't just some delusion.
Not at all. Furthermore, cognitive abilities are multifaceted. Some people generally have a higher verbal ability, while others naturally possess a much higher spatial capacity.
So having a good visual memory is a real cognitive ability.
It is. The fatal flaw, the neuromyth itself, occurs when we conflate a preference or an ability with an exclusive learning style.
Ah, I see. We confuse what we enjoy with what actually drives retention.
Exactly. Preference does not equal effectiveness.
It's like my comfort zone. Just because I prefer sitting on the couch doesn't mean it's the best way to train for a marathon. And just because I prefer watching a slick animation over reading a dense textbook doesn't mean I'm actually retaining the information better.
You're just enjoying the delivery truck more.
Exactly.
And this brings us to a really crucial concept in cognitive psychology called desirable difficulty. The research shows that engaging with challenging content outside of our preferred style, doing the thing that feels a little less comfortable, often builds significantly stronger neural pathways.
Wait, really? So the struggle actually helps?
Yes, when you have to work harder to extract the meaning because it isn't being effortlessly spoon-fed to you in your favorite format, that cognitive friction signals to the brain that this information is important.
Wow, so the friction itself cements the memory deeper into your semantic network.
Precisely. You want that cognitive friction.
So what does this all mean? We mistook what we like for what we need, and we try to avoid the cognitive friction that actually builds memory. But is believing in learning styles really that dangerous? I mean, it feels like a relatively harmless misunderstanding.
You would think so, but Newton's research highlights exactly why it is actively destructive. The widespread acceptance of learning styles causes genuine educational harm.
How so? Like, what's the actual damage being done?
It creates severe self-limiting beliefs.
Ugh.
It fundamentally alters how people view their own potential, especially when it's pushed by corporate HR departments or teacher training programs.
Are you talking about learned helplessness?
Yes, exactly that.
Mm.
Adults encounter a difficult subject, struggle with it, and instead of recognizing that learning is supposed to be hard, they blame the format and opt out entirely.
That is tragic. So a professional in their 30s might definitively label themselves as a visual learner, and then what?
Well, what happens when they need to learn a highly conceptual, auditory, or kinesthetic skill?
Yeah.
They falsely believe they lack the biological capacity to master it, simply because the subject doesn't fit their assigned style.
They misattribute a simple preference to a hardwired limit on their actual intelligence. That is a massive hidden danger.
It really is. And furthermore, these labels distract learners from employing study techniques that are actually proven to work.
Right. If these labels are actively creating learned helplessness, what tools are we leaving on the table? If we strip away these harmful labels, how can you, the listener, actually optimize your learning process right now?
Well, the sources outline 3 highly actionable proven strategies. The first one, pulling directly from Pashler's research, is that you must match the instructional method to the content, not the learner.
The content dictates the method. Okay, that makes sense.
Yes. If you are learning geography, the subject is inherently spatial and visual. You need a map.
Right. You cannot learn the complex shape of the Norwegian coastline just by having someone describe it to you, regardless of whether you took a test that said you're an auditory learner. The subject demands a visual method.
Conversely, if you are learning to speak conversational Japanese, you need to hear the cadence and pronunciation. You need audio.
Because you cannot learn a verbal accent purely from reading a textbook, even if you are a self-proclaimed visual learner.
Exactly. You let the subject matter tell you how it needs to be learned.
Which naturally leads to the second strategy, emphasized heavily by Newton. You have to actively ditch the label.
You really do. The cognitive overhead of constantly trying to translate the world into your preferred format is exhausting.
Just stop saying, I just don't learn well by listening. You have to embrace the scientific reality that your brain is highly adaptable.
Fully capable of processing meaning through all sensory modalities. And removing that mental barrier is the prerequisite for the third strategy.
Which is what? What should we replace these labels with?
You must replace the energy you used to spend worrying about your learning style with techniques proven universally effective. The most powerful of these is active recall.
Oh, active recall. Let's break down the mechanism there, because this completely contradicts how most of us were taught to study.
It really does. Most people just reread notes.
Right. But active recall is the practice of closing the book, putting away your notes, and forcing your brain to retrieve the information from scratch.
To understand why this works, we have to look at the difference between storage strength and retrieval strength in the brain. Robert Bjork, one of the researchers on the Pashler paper, extensively studies this.
Storage strength versus retrieval strength. Okay, what's the difference?
When you just reread your notes or rewatch a lecture, the information is right in front of your eyes. Your brain processes it fluently, which creates an illusion of competence.
You think, I recognize this, therefore I know it.
Exactly. But recognition is not the same as recall. You are building storage strength, but your retrieval strength, your actual ability to pull that information up when you need it in a high-pressure meeting, remains incredibly weak.
So that struggle to retrieve is the entire point.
Yes. The act of pulling that information out of your brain without any external cues, is the physical mechanism that signals to your neurons that this specific pathway is important and needs to be fortified.
Every time you successfully recall a piece of information, you are literally changing the physical structure of your brain to make that memory easier to access next time.
Exactly. Which pairs perfectly with spaced repetition.
Right, because you don't just do active recall once. You space it out. You force your brain to recall the information today, then 2 days from now, then a week from now.
Yes, you are intentionally interrupting the brain's natural forgetting process just as the memory starts to fade.
Just when it starts to get a little fuzzy.
Precisely. That spacing takes advantage of synaptic consolidation. By forcing yourself to retrieve it right when it's getting difficult to remember, you maximize that desirable difficulty we talked about earlier.
It triggers a much stronger biological signal to reinforce that neural connection than if you had just reviewed it continuously in one sitting.
Much stronger.
Okay, so we match the method to the content, we ditch the labels, we use active recall, and we space out our practice. But there is one more technique mentioned in the literature that feels a bit like a paradox, considering everything we've just discussed about visual learners.
You're talking about dual coding.
Yes, dual coding, it sounds like a contradiction.
It really does sound like one, but dual coding is perhaps the most fascinating application of semantic memory. It's the practice of intentionally combining verbal information words with visual information, like pictures or diagrams.
Wait, if I intentionally use pictures and diagrams, aren't I just catering to visual learning again?
Not at all. Dual coding is highly effective for everyone, entirely regardless of their personal preferences. The mechanism here is about creating multiple entry points to the same semantic concept.
Oh, I see.
When you read a complex text and simultaneously review a diagram that represents that exact same text, you are giving your brain two distinct parallel neural pathways to the same underlying meaning.
You are anchoring the concept verbally and spatially at the same time.
Exactly. So if the verbal pathway degrades over time, or you get nervous and forget the exact phrasing, the spatial pathway might still be intact, leading you back to the core meaning.
So it's not about catering to a visual style. It's about building a more robust, interconnected schema.
It creates a profoundly resilient memory. So instead of trying to perfectly tailor the external world to fit inside this narrow imaginary box of how you think you learn, you use dual coding, active recall, and spaced repetition.
Because these are the tools that are actually built to hack the human brain's natural architectural systems. This is huge for anyone listening who needs to tackle a massive research report for work or, finally learn that new software.
Absolutely. You weren't restricted to one lane.
What an absolute journey this has been. We started today with this pervasive neuromyth, this comfortable little lie that promises learning will be effortless if we just find our personalized secret code.
And we saw how quickly that falls apart.
Right. The meshing hypothesis completely falls apart under rigorous laboratory testing because human memory isn't a digital filing cabinet of JPEGs and audio files. It is a complex, meaning-making web of schemas.
It's all about semantic memory.
Yes, and we explored how confusing our personal preferences for actual neurological effectiveness leads to the tragedy of learned helplessness, where adults artificially limit their own intellectual potential.
Which is the real danger here.
Totally. But finally, we've replaced that myth with a toolkit of proven, science-backed mechanics, matching the content to the medium, embracing the friction of active recall, spacing out our retrieval, and anchoring concepts through dual coding.
It really requires a profound shift in perspective. You have to abandon the comfort of the label and embrace the reality of the work. And this raises an important question, one that completely reframes the entire subjective experience of learning something difficult.
Oh, where does all this leave us when we are in the thick of a really frustrating learning curve?
Well, since the cognitive science clearly shows that desirable difficulty engaging with challenging content and forcing retrieval actually builds stronger neural pathways.
Yeah.
What if the frustration you feel when you are struggling to learn a new skill isn't a sign that it's being presented in the wrong style?
Wow. Wait.
What if that intense feeling of friction, that headache of trying to grasp a difficult concept, isn't a signal that you are failing, but is actually just the physical sensation of your brain building new, stronger connections?
I love that. The struggle isn't a red flag telling you to quit. It's the tangible feeling of your neural networks actually growing. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Now, go tackle that next big learning challenge without any labels holding you back.